start with our first plenary session with Mr. Ben Knight, Director of Language Research at Cambridge University Press. Mr. Knight leads on using high-quality academic research to develop more effective learning materials and resources. With his expertise in curriculum development and pedagogical research, he helps to underpin Cambridge's educational resources with research-based insights and conceptual models. He has taught in schools and universities in Europe, Africa, and Asia, and has worked on educational reform projects from Mexico to Japan. So let's lend our ears now to Mr. Knight with his presentation entitled, How Can English Programs Improve Students' Employability Skills? Over to you, Mr. Knight.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you hear me clearly? Can you hear me?
I think you have to bring the mic a little bit closer.
Okay. Is that better? Can you hear me now?
Is that better? Can you hear me now?
Yes, much better.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Jazim, for your introduction. Thank you very much to the University of Bahrain for inviting me to talk at this wonderful conference. I listened to the first session, really interesting, and I look at the program. It's such a wonderful range of speakers. It's a privilege and a pleasure to be part of this. Thank you. Now I'm going to share my screen so you can see the slides I'm going to use. Okay, has that come up now?
Yes, we can see that.
You can see that. Okay. So what I'm going to talk about today is how we can use our English language programs to develop the kinds of employability skills that our students need and which were discussed in the previous session. But first of all, what I'd like to do is let me just move it on. I'd like us to step back a little bit before I go into the detail of this. And I'd like us to ask ourselves, how do we see our students and how do we see our role in their education? So do we see them as going through a graduation process, and what we are doing is helping them to register, we give them a curriculum, we help them to learn, we assess them, they graduate, we give them a qualification, and then they use that qualification to get a job? And is that our role in their education? Or do we see each student as an individual who is trying to find their place in the world, who is trying to find where they're going to develop into, what kind of career fits them and suits their abilities and their aspirations, and what are the skills that they need to develop to realize their potential? Do we see our role as teachers, as instructors, as developing the potential of those individuals to contribute to the world around us? Well, in reality, any of us who are experienced in education know that we have to do both, that we want to do both. We know that qualifications give our students options. They help them get in the door, get to the interview. And so they need those qualifications. They need to get through the assessments which are essential for those qualifications. But at the same time, we know we're also driven by the need, the wish to develop them as individuals, to develop those skills they need throughout their lives, not just for the exams. So the challenge for us is to work out how can we take both perspectives in the limited time we have. How can we have a program which is developing our students in both ways? And the first step I'd like to take in this is to think about what is it that employers really need when they are recruiting and when they are promoting people in their organizations. And this was discussed in the previous session. It was really interesting. What we've been doing in Cambridge is to be looking at research with employers around the world, really considering we're in a globalized world, environment, economy, and that we need to be able to think not just of our own local requirements, but what's needed in international organizations as well. And so we've reviewed and summarized research carried out by a lot of people around the world. What I've done here is I've given you a link to the summary of our research into what employers are looking for. And if you've got a phone, you can get to that same summary through the QR code. And you can see we've been talking to careers organizations, we've been looking at the reports from careers organizations, from World Economic Forum, from the National Association of Colleges and Employers in the US, the OECD, British Council, City of London, CIPD. These are all leading organizations in employer and understanding what employers are looking for. And we've looked at their research and tried to summarize it. And when we look at all that research, what we found is there are some things which are required or looked for more than others. And these were the 20 most common, frequently mentioned skills or things that employers are looking for when they are thinking about what makes someone successful in their organization. Now, actually this list of 20 tells us how employers see it. It uses the language that employers will use. However, it is quite a mixed list. It's got things which are overlapping. Some things are not really skills. They're more to do with personal characteristics, personality traits. Some are a bit technical. So at Cambridge, we step back from this and try to analyze what's behind this. What are the real skills and competencies that underlie these points that the employers are making? And we organize them into 8 categories. Let me just move the picture of the video there. So these categories are collaboration and teamwork, communication, innovation and problem solving, creativity, thinking, critical thinking and decision making, leadership and global citizenship, personal development and management, emotional intelligence, and digital literacy. And at this top level, this is not particularly groundbreaking. You can find similar types of categories in many organizations that have been looking at these skills. But what we've done next is to try and break them down into more detail. So if in this one here, you can see one of the categories was collaboration and teamwork. And we've broken that down into 3 main areas. If you look on the left of the screen, working well together in a group, how you work together, managing collaborative tasks and projects, so managing the tasks in that collaboration, and then delivering a group task effectively. How do you make sure it gets done? And then within those, we've broken down each of those 3 areas into the detailed skills which are needed to be able to do those. So, for example, to manage collaborative tasks, you have to first of all be able to agree what needs to be done. You need to manage the distribution of tasks in the group, and you have to make best use of the skills and knowledge of the colleagues who are in that group. So by doing this, we are able to really create like a curriculum, a deeper understanding of what are the skills that we want to develop in our students. This deeper understanding, which is approached systematically, helps us to take a more effective approach to developing these skills. And one thing I just want to mention is something that came up in the previous session. The discussion was the importance of education leading, school education leading into higher education, universities leading to employment. So in this particular case, I'm talking to you about employability competencies, but actually this links very closely to our Cambridge Life Competencies Framework, which is a framework which we use for making sense of these skills throughout the educational system, right from kindergarten up to university. How can we see the development of these skills in a systematic, coherent way? And the framework here that I'm referring to, Cambridge Life Competencies Framework, you would find really useful if you're thinking about the overall education system. And there's a link at the bottom of the page, cambridge.org, CLCF. And one of the nice things about this framework is that there's a lot of detail in there. We have can-do statements of what people can do as they master the skills, which you can use for assessment purposes. There's teacher guidance, there's language which you can use to teach if you're teaching English, to support the development of those skills. Now, I just want to step back a little bit, because when we show all the detail of this framework, its benefit is that it gives clarity and understanding, but it can be a bit overwhelming. So I just wanted you to look at this. This is a tourist map of a famous city. Unfortunately, I'm not with you here, so I want to ask you questions, but I can't really see your answers. So there'll be rhetorical questions. So my first question to you is, which is this city? And I hope you're all screaming at the screen to say it's London. Now, if you arrive in London as a tourist, you get a tourist map like this, and you can see there are lots of places to visit. But perhaps you've only got 2 days. Do you, at that point, panic? Do you say, oh my God, I've got so many places to visit. I've only got 2 days. I can't do it. What am I going to do? No, you don't do that. What you actually do is you say, look, I've got 2 days. I can see maybe 3 or 4 things in those 2 days. So what are the most interesting, what are the most important things that I want to see? What are the 4 most important things? So I want you to think of that when you think of the framework of employability skills. There are too many things that you could teach, but you need to see it as a list of the things that could be developed in your students. You then need to make a decision about what capacity have you got, how much time have you got, and therefore which are the most important things for your students, depending on which direction they're going in terms of their career, the skills that are needed for that, plus where their own strengths and weaknesses are. So there's always an element of choice about what your priorities are. So you can see the framework as a map to produce your must-do list. It's not the must-do list itself. Okay, so now really I want to start thinking about the English language program and how you can develop those kind of skills we've been talking about at the same time as teaching English, so that you're doing both things in an integrated way. And one of the approaches is just to look for opportunities in the English language activities that you're doing. Look for those opportunities where you can develop the employability skills at the same time, and maybe just extending that activity a little bit. And I'm going to give you some examples so that you can understand what I'm talking about. They're quite straightforward examples. So here is an activity, the typical activity from a Cambridge course, where it's a listening comprehension. You're going to listen to a video where 2 people are discussing whether they should leave their home in the countryside to move into the city, into the town. So in this discussion, of course, as an English language teacher, you could be just asking comprehension questions. What does this mean? What do they mean by this, etc. But you can also see this as an opportunity to develop your students' ability to agree and disagree in a respectful way, because one of the skills of collaboration is that ability to listen respectfully and respond constructively to what other people are saying or contributing. So when you're listening to the conversation, to the discussion that these 2 are having, you could be asking your students to listen for the kinds of phrases that they use to express agreement or disagreement in a respectful way. And then you can start to build this up. And when you're thinking about how you can respond constructively, you can think about, well, what are the ways that people do respond constructively? And one of the ways you can do it is to build on others' ideas. Another way is to acknowledge the other's point of view. Another way is to suggest alternatives. And one thing you need to be able to do is to politely interrupt someone if they're running out of time. So these are kind of skills of collaboration. And what you can do is to focus on what are the English phrases that you might use to do these things. And if we were in a group together, I would be asking you to give your suggestions. But now I'm just going to give you them. So if you're building on others' ideas, yes, and another thing is, that's true, yes, that's true, and I also think. And similarly, acknowledge other points of view, yes, that's a good point, etc. Suggest alternatives, have you thought about, another idea could be, and politely interrupt, okay, shall we move on? We've only 10 minutes. So when you're teaching these, you're teaching English language phrases, but you're also teaching people how to respond constructively to what others are saying. And if we had time, I would ask you to use these phrases working together with the person next to you on a discussion. The discussion I would have asked you is, in the future, we won't need teachers because we'll learn everything through our mobile phones. And I think you'll get quite a lot of agreement and disagreement on that. And it would be interesting to see how you could sound polite and constructive in that discussion. But we're going to have to skip that. Okay, here's another example. Critical thinking. One of the key aspects of critical thinking is being able to judge the reasons and the examples that people use to support their argument. So this is another listening activity from Unlock, one of our Cambridge courses. And this is about nuclear energy. And to start them thinking about this, you can get them working in groups, thinking about advantages and disadvantages. That's just tuning them in. But when they listen to it, instead of asking simple, straightforward reading comprehension questions, you can be asking them to analyze, first of all, are they for and against? And that requires you to stand back and make an evaluation of their overall argument, but also to get into the details of their argument. What are the reasons they are giving? And this is, we know this is an important part of critical thinking. Anybody who's looking at the news in the United States at the moment will see the importance of having evidence for your arguments. It's a very topical skill at the moment. Okay, another skill that we need in the workplace and in our lives, throughout our lives really, is working in groups. And one of the skills of being able to work in a group and teams is understanding the different roles in that team. So again, in an English language program, we can bring this out. We can be quite explicit. So we're using English, we're teaching them English, but we're also making them think about roles in a team. And so we might have a kind of exercise like this, where we have different roles, we have descriptions of what those roles are responsible for, and we ask them to match those together. And it's just a way of helping them to think more consciously about what their roles are within a group and what they do. And then you can follow that up with an activity where they put it into practice. So this again comes from Cambridge course Unlock. Planning a charity fundraising event. And so you put them into groups, you check their understanding of the roles, they agree who's doing the roles, or you assign the roles, and they complete the task, they present to each other their plan, and then they review what worked well in the group and what could be improved. So you are using English throughout this, but you're also helping them to think about how can they work more effectively together. Okay, another approach, rather than just looking for opportunities to extend a language learning activity, you can also think of project-based activities which are really good at integrating all of these employability skills into one activity. And project-based activities are really a good way to approach these kind of skills. So this again is an example from Unlock Level 3. And here the students are being asked to pitch an idea for a new health product or program. And if we think about the stages of doing that activity, we can see how it links to employability skills. So the first stage, the content stage, they're thinking, what is their program? What's the health program that they're going to pitch? What are the ideas in it? And that's really an opportunity to focus on creative thinking. Then they have to think about the structure of their pitch, their presentation, and that's a point for critical thinking. When they prepare the pitch, they can work together on that, testing it out, giving feedback, and that's an opportunity for group work. When they give the pitch, that's their opportunity to practice their communication skills. And then when they reflect, when you give them feedback and they reflect on it, that's an opportunity to develop their personal development skills, their learning to learn skills. Okay, so if we look at this example, when they're thinking of the content of what their health program is going to be, we first of all can introduce them to using ideas maps as a way of brainstorming, of being creative in their thinking, because it allows a lot more kind of flexibility and unconstrained thinking. And then, so they're practicing a skill which they will find useful even outside the English language classroom. When it comes to the structure of it, we give them an example of a script, and then we ask them to analyze the structure of the example here. And what you can see is it's a problem solution type of structure that when you're making the pitch, you say what you convince people that they've got a problem, and then you convince them you've got the solution. And so this looks at the use of rhetorical questions at the beginning, the way that it introduces the problems, and then the solutions. Then they can work together, and this is an opportunity for you to practice their ability to give feedback to each other about their ideas, to pool their ideas in a constructive way. And then, of course, there's communication. Now, communication might sound like it's about English language skills, but actually it's about skills beyond that. It's about your ability to speak with confidence and fluency, your use of body language, your use of pitch and rate to keep people engaged. And then finally, you can get them to reflect on what things they've done, what they've done well, how they can improve it. So I've tried to speed up a little bit because we started late. So to sum up, first of all, what we need to do is to understand as clearly as possible what are the skills our students need, and that's why we have this employability skills framework from Cambridge to give us that understanding. But then we need to decide what are the priorities for our particular students, which of those skills matter most to them. We then look to integrate the development of those skills within the English program, not to have a separate employability skills course or program, but to integrate it within the curriculum. And we talked about two ways, we looked at two ways of doing this. One way is to look for opportunities within the existing lessons, to just extend them and to find ways of focusing on the employability skills of those activities. And the second is to create these integrated skills projects which allow you to join together the different skills in a realistic situation. So that's what I wanted to talk to you about. So now I'm going to go over to you and to ask questions if you've got any questions. And just to remind you of what Helen Keller said, a well-educated mind will always have more questions than answers. So I hope you're going to demonstrate that with lots of questions. And I'm going to stop sharing the screen so I can see if there's a chat or a QA, or if there's any way of asking questions. So, okay, I'm looking at the QA one first, and this is Thamimul Ansari. Apologies for mispronouncing your name. How can we customize our training modules and teaching methods in response to culture differences? And that is really a very good question, because one of the reasons we don't want to say this is how you teach any particular skill is that we know that people are working within different cultural contexts, and that to a large extent you as teachers who understand that will need to adjust to that. But I'd also say that one of the objectives of education is to be able to skill people up in dealing with people who come from a different culture, and that while you need to understand your own culture and to be able to communicate to other people, you also want to find ways of helping them to understand where other people are coming from. I mean, I think maybe I'm not exactly answering your question. If we look at something like how do people work together? Now, it's true that in different cultures, the way that you work together in its detail might be different. But I think some of the principles behind it are the same. We know that you need to respond respectfully and constructively to people in your group. the way you actually do that in one country or in another country can look very different. You know, I used to teach in Japan, and the way that you work together looks very different to how it happens in the US, for example. People have much more kind of gaps between listening to people, make sure they're finished speaking before you speak. In the US, it's okay to kind of interrupt people as they're speaking. So there are different cultural norms, but the general principle that you should be constructive and respectful in your response to people, I think, remains the same. Okay, what other questions have we got? Hala Al-Furi. Learning language is important to have it in working in groups. How can we adapt the virtual learning to be able to do it productively instead of just explaining online and then wait for an answer or a question from a student? Yeah, very good question. And this is, of course, is a challenge in these days. All of us as teachers, especially language teachers, are used to taking advantage of the fact that students are there in front of us and that communication is normal in that kind of situation. Online has tended to be a kind of passive thing. But there are ways of doing it. I mean, here we're on Zoom, and Zoom has breakout rooms, and similarly, even on other platforms, there are ways of creating groups and asking people to work together in groups and then come back to you and report. I think I would try and make use of that, but also to some extent you can be asking people to do things and then come back offline, so they can do things offline and then come back online. It's not the same as being in a classroom where everything has to happen in the classroom. I think we're online, we can be more tolerant of saying you've got 5 minutes, 10 minutes to do something and then come back. Okay, many of the textbooks we use, this is Ahmed Rawashde. Many of the textbooks we use, technical language ones, are quite old. I mean, they do not quite match the language used in the work field. What do you suggest for addressing this issue? And this is definitely a big challenge. I mean, fortunately, one of the advantages we have these days is we have the internet. And certainly, I think most teachers of technical language that I know are relying a lot on going to particular sites which are going to have that kind of technical language. One of the things I find is that it's usually what people need to learn when they're learning English for technical reasons is not so much the technical terms, because the technical terms are part of learning that subject, but it's more the language which is used to describe them, to explain them. And so personally, I find it much more useful to go to websites which are not very technical, but ones which are meant for explaining technical issues to the general public. And so I find things like TED Talks to be really good, because some of those are actually coming from quite technical backgrounds, those people, but they're speaking in a way which is addressing the general public. And so that gives your students the chance to understand the language used to explain technology rather than the technical terms themselves. Learning language is important to have it in working groups. Sorry, that's the same one. How can we measure the attainment of skills like critical thinking? These can be subjective, so are they measurable? Now, there are attempts, that's a really good question. There are attempts to develop tests of these. The PISA tests, if I'm not sure if you're aware of these, have started at multiple choice questions around working in collaboration, collaborative thinking, collaborative working, but they are quite difficult to develop those. So what we've been doing at the moment in Cambridge is to develop these can-do statements. So these are descriptions of the skills that people at each level, from kindergarten up to university, should be able to do for each of the skills that you might be focusing on. And so you can use those can-do statements as descriptors which you compare your students to. So it's not a real test, but it's a kind of way of making it less subjective, a bit more objective. If it says the student is able to use these phrases in being able to disagree politely with someone. So they're able to do that. If you as a teacher are making that judgment, so it's not a measure, but it is a bit more controlled and objective than simply thinking about it without having that control. So if you look at the Life Competencies Framework site, you'll see the can-do statements there. Which is the best way to teach Arab language teaching method for Arab students? Well, I mean, I have to tell you that Arab students are really like all students all around the world. It's the same challenge everywhere. Obviously, there are going to be some language differences that the features of Arabic, which are different from English, can make some aspects of English more difficult than others. So there's that aspect, and again, I think the most important thing really with all language teaching methodology is to be thinking about what the actual objective at the end. If it's to be communication, then you have to be thinking of each activity as leading to communication. So it may be that you have to focus on a grammar point. It may be that you need to do some controlled practice to begin with in order to master the details of the language, but that needs to be building up to a communicative activity in that lesson. How am I doing for time? I'm aware that I'm pretty much over time. What should I do? Should I carry on answering questions, or should we? 2 minutes. Is that 2 minutes? Thank you. Okay. Would you explain where autonomous learning fits in the skills ranking? Actually, that's a good question and not an easy one to answer. Autonomous learning actually covers quite a number of things, but in this employability skills framework, we had something called personal development, and in the life competency framework we talk about learning to learn, and this is often the development of those skills which are needed for your students to be able to learn without you outside the classroom, and we detail that in the framework. But it's the kind of things like being able to set your learning goals, being able to develop habits of learning which will maintain your motivation, and being able to review your effectiveness as a learner, what things are working and what things are not working. So that's the way I would say autonomous learning is. How are employability skills development essentially different from communicative teaching? Yeah, I mean, there is a lot of overlap. Obviously, one of the key employability skills is communication. And even, I'm not sure if I mentioned this at the beginning, but now English language skills themselves are an employability skill in the world. So obviously there's a lot of overlap, but there are some areas which are perhaps, and things like critical thinking. When you're doing reading comprehension of text, often there's an element of critical thinking in there. So there is a lot of overlap. I think what I've been talking about is just pushing it in certain directions where it might not naturally fall. So things like creative thinking, creativity, innovation, problem solving, these are areas which are compatible with communicative teaching, but are maybe not emphasized as much. I'd love to talk to you all day, and there are fantastic questions here, but I'm afraid I think I've run out of time, and out of respect for the next speaker, I better close. So I'd just like to say thank you very much for listening and for participating and for your great questions. Thank you.
And thank you, Mr. Knight, for that insightful and thought-provoking presentation. Really marvelous.